I can
Karina,
yes.
Dr. Carina Jahani, Manihiala, sorry, I think you know Dr. Carina Jahani very well, and she's one of the most distinguished linguists in Baluchi anyway, and then all of us really have enjoyed her scholarship, meaning scholarly works, and then her all research that she has done, and then you can listen to her paper about Baluchi language.
Again, I would like to thank you so much from the Baloch Cultural Society for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's very good to meet new acquaintances and renew contacts with people whom we met maybe 5 years ago or more. So it's very nice to be here. Particularly, I would like to thank you, Mr. Shahid Baloch. You have taken great trouble to make this event come true. So, and I think it's really important to have these gatherings where you focus on culture, on language, on issues that are debatable. It shouldn't be dangerous to take a debate. It's useful for scholarship and it's useful for our personal interaction. I may touch a little bit upon the issue of the neglect of the Balochi language, but my main issue was to present a study that I did a couple of months ago about an urban mind in Baluchi literature, and it would tie together a little bit with what Hoshang said previously about globalization processes are very, but particularly about cosmopolitarianism. I think that was a word you had, cosmopolitarism, because it does touch upon issues such as urban versus rural values. I will try to present this quite quickly. Balochistan, the land of the Baloch, is divided between Iran and Pakistan by the so-called Goldsmith Line, a border demarcation which was the result of a border commission headed by the British General Goldsmith in 1870 to 72. You all know this. And exactly when the Baloch arrived in their present habitat is hard to determine. Marco Polo reports that this area, which he called Kesmakoran, had its own ruler, and that the people lived by commerce as much as agriculture, trading both overland and by sea in all directions. Spooner holds that the Baloch immigration into the coastal area known as Makran started in the 11th century AD and intensified in the 13th century when Turkish tribes started invading the Iranian plateau from the east. According to the epic tradition of the Baloch themselves, they are of Arabic origin and migrated from Aleppo in Syria after the Battle of Karbala in AD 680. According to the majority of the Baloch, although the majority of the Baloch today are Sunni Muslims, tradition has it that the Battle of Karbala they fought on the side of the Shiite Imam and martyr Hussein against the enemy, the Umayyad Caliph Yazid. This is likely an attempt to establish a true Islamic genealogy for Balochi. Looking at language, one would rather try to claim an Indo-European origin, at least for a number of Baloch tribes that were, so to speak, a core in the Baloch ethnicity. The Baloch language is spoken in the province of Balochistan in southwestern Pakistan, etc., etc. Northwestern Pakistan, in the province of Sistan and Balochistan, southeastern Iran, in Punjab and Sindh, which we heard about, as well as by Baloch who have settled in Khorasan, Golestan, Afghanistan, the Gulf states, Turkmenistan, India, East Africa, and nowadays also in North America, Europe, and Australia. It's difficult to estimate the total number of Balochi speakers. Many Baloch, particularly in areas bordering Indian languages, as we've also heard in Punjab and Sindh, and Persian in the western part of Balochi-speaking areas, identify themselves as Baloch but no longer speak the language. The same is true of many Baloch in East Africa and on the Arabian Peninsula, whereas the Baloch in Turkmenistan have retained their language reasonably well. Another reason why it's difficult to give any certain figures for Balochi speakers is that the first and second languages are not always recorded in censuses carrying out in the countries where Balochi is spoken. It's a sensitive issue, it's a political issue to ask what your language is, because If people start to think what their language is, they may think about ethnicity and identity in a way that the national state would not want. A serious attempt was a serious attempt to estimate the number of Baluchi speakers. Was done by myself in 1989. I believe today there would be maybe up to as many as 8 and 10 million Baluchi speakers, and maybe, if not equally many, but certain millions that identify as Baluchi but do not longer speak the language. Baluchi is neither an official language nor a language of education in any of the countries where it's spoken. This is reflected, for example, in the lack of standard written norm for Balochi, to which I would have liked to come back, but I don't know if I have time. This is a very tricky issue, the lack of standard written norm for Balochi. There is also a dispute about which dialect or dialects ought to be the basis of the literary language. On the whole, writing and reading Balochi is at the moment an exclusive activity carried out by a small number of peoples belonging to the Baloch literary elite, mainly in Pakistan. Thus, Balochi is, as a minority language, largely restricted to traditional and informal domains such as family, neighborhood, traditional occupations, pastoralism and agriculture. A career outside these traditional sectors is linked to a great extent to higher education and good command of the national language, which is, of course, an issue that is problematic for Balochi. And I was just reading, by the way, on my way back from another journey, I was starting reading Tonna Pentran by Sidi Kazat, and he also argues about that, and he says in several places to read Balochi if there are any readers. Reading Balochi if there are any readers. And what is really crucial to Balochi is to increase the number of readers. A language will not be a strong written language with 100, 200, 300 elite readers. We need grassroots movements for reading and writing. And efforts to preserve and promote the Balochi language are mainly of an unofficial character, based on private initiative, like this initiative today, which is very laudable. However, there is a growing concern among the Baloch that their language may well be lost within a few generations if it doesn't develop a written standard. The Baloch have traditionally sustained themselves as pastoral nomadism and on seasonal agriculture and date cultivation, and to some degree on fishing. Fishing is limited to the shores of the Indian Ocean, to the southwesternmost coastal areas of Balochi. Agriculture and date cultivation prevail in the lowlands of southern Balochistan, as well as oases along rivers, for example in Iranian Sarawak and Pakistani Haram. Further to the north, the main occupation has traditionally been pastoral nomadism. The tribal structure has been both a uniting and a separating factor among freeborn Baloch in all Balochistan. It has been easy for originally non-Baloch tribes and clans to associate with and be incorporated into the Balochi tribal system. And the unity within the tribe has also traditionally been very strong. However, tribal loyalties are often felt to hamper a nationalist movement. And nowadays, many intellectual Baloch try to promote the replacement of tribal loyalties with a national Balochi loyalty. Balochistan is situated at the crossroads between east and west, north and south. From Alexander the Great's times onwards, many conquerors have passed through this region. The Sea of Oman also links Balochistan to the Arabian Peninsula and Eastern Africa. These geopolitical conditions of Balochistan have caused a considerable amount of migration. The main natural reasons for migration from Balochistan is the long droughts that often plague the area. That's the main natural reasons. The main socio-political reasons have been different kinds of occupation and forceful coercion of power. Political changes that have caused migration out of Balochistan include attempts on the part of the central Iranian government to subdue local Baloch rulers in the 1850s onwards and in 1928 onwards. Also in the 1950s, a number of Iranian Baloch sought refuge in Yemen after revolting against Muhammad Reza Shah. And we know that also after the Islamic Revolution, there was a major outflow, particularly of a number of educated young Baloch. It's interesting to note that there are two different words in Baluchi to define nomads and settled agriculturalists. In former times, it was only the Baloch pastoral nomads that were known by the term Baloch, whereas the agriculturalists were called townspeople, Shahri. This latter term suggests that the village where the agriculturalists lived was indeed some sort of an urban centre. And then in this paper, which is available in a limited number of copies, I have described Quetta, Sibi, and Bampur, also named Bampur, Pahara, Sarawan, Chabahar, Bir, Lagwa, Darkharan, Khuzdar, and other urban centres. I also comment that it's hard to speak about a written Baluchi literature before 1950s. Of course, there were writings in Baluchi before the 1950s, but it was mainly outsiders who recorded oral traditions of the Baloch. From the 1950s onwards, we can talk about more of a literary, written Baluchi literary movement, although very limited. What the main idea of this paper was to investigate if there is an urban mind in Baluchi oral literature, and how to define urbanity. Well, actually, we were doing this project together with archaeologists, and they had this Gordon Child who had come up with very interesting definitions of urbanity. Should I read them? In point of size, the first cities must have been more extensive and more densely populated than any other previous settlements, although considerable smaller than many villages today. So when we in historical times are talking about urban settlements, they do not need to be very big. And then the function of the village, that there, in addition to peasants and others, there were also specialist craftsmen in these town-type settlements, like transport workers, merchants, officials, priests, etc. That the primary production caused a tiny surplus so that one would be able to offer some sacrifice to an imaginary deity, a divine king, or anything else. Some kind of monumental public buildings created from this surplus. Now we can talk, for example, about Egypt, and we know that we are talking about huge monumental public buildings, but not necessarily, but some sort of monumental buildings. Priests, civil and military leaders and officials who would absorb a major share of the concentrated surplus and form a ruling class, some kind of rule, and then in big writing. That's one of Child's criteria. And the elaboration of some sciences, other specialists, artists, arts, etc., and regular foreign trade over quite long distances, and some sort of solidarity that would keep this community together. Actually, I wanted to add another factor, some kind of monetary economy. Now, it was a very interesting thing to look for these phenomena in the Baluchi oral literature. And I don't think the Baluchi oral literature maybe is very different from other oral literatures, but anyway. So what I did was that I looked at 5 folk tales in Baluchi to see whether some of these parameters of urbanity could be seen there, if they were crucial and significant, and if there is indeed an urban mind, in Baluchi oral literature. So the first story I was looking at was Waja Panch Kosh, which is a story of a poor man who decides to leave the town where he's living and move to another kingdom. And there he happens to become the chief minister of the king by claiming that he can kill 5 tigers all at once, which of course he has never done. His duty as the chief minister is to ward off any dangers to the king and his rule, As soon as he's given a new mission, he returns home and starts beating his wife, who had once mockingly called him Waja Panchkosh, something which he had taken as a pretext for his claim at the king's court. But by pure luck and the skills of his wife, he successfully fights tigers and thieves and attacks the king's enemies. Maybe you've heard the story, it's a very nice one. On one of his missions, he dresses up as a businessman in order to fight robbers. Finally, he receives half the kingdom. So, what do we see here? I would say we see a strong urban mind. He comes from a halk, which is not the ideal, and goes to a shahr, which is the ideal. In this shahr, he goes to the king, he goes to the king's court. He fights bakkals, he hires construction workers to build a Marri palace for himself. He appears at the king's diwan, and in addition to the Badshah, we also have Wazir and Wakil. In the story, these Wazir and Wakil are not able to do what Waja Panchkosh does when he fights all the enemies. There are Sipahis, there is Merojang, and Mr. Five Slayer, Waja Panchkosh, is transformed throughout the story from being poor and destitute, Bewasu Nezgar, into Lord of half of the kingdom, Bajayi Niyamage Waja. So what's the ideal? It's definitely not for him to be the most successful cattle owner or the best agriculturalists. It's to become Bajayi Niyamage Waja. And if you think about these parameters, they really shine through. That Shahr is better than Halk. There are craftsmen involved. There are these Tahinuk, these builders. There are dukandars, and there are all sorts of things, etc., etc. Moving to another story, Musa o Khudai Gojnagim Bandak, recorded from Sistan, Moses and the starving man. This story is about Moses, the prophet Moses, who meets a destitute starving man. The man asks Moses to intercede for him and plead with God to give him everything that has been provided for his whole lifetime in one go, so that he can fill his stomach, even if for once. God does so, and since the poor man cannot eat all the food, he gives some away as alms. God rewards him, and at the end of the story, the man becomes the foremost businessman in the whole world. So, what we see here is definitely that we have a mediator between man and God. We have Moses, who is playing the role of a mediator between God and humans, which is sort of one of the urban ideas. Then we see this about an economic surplus, giving alms for the sake of God, Birahi Khuda. And there are references to tradesmen because they go to the marketplace, to the bazaar, to buy things. And the transformation in the story is what? It's the starving fellow, the Gujnagim Bandag, who becomes Tajjar Jahan, the tradesman of the world, whatever that means. So even here, we see that there is a strong urban ideal. Then we have the little lizard girl, Gojok, the story of which you may have read, who makes her fortune by robbing a bakkal, and from her parents are here making this transformation from being poor and destitute again to becoming rich, Maldar or Ganjdar. And then there is another very interesting story recorded in Fars in a very special dialect of Baluchi, which many of you may not even have heard of. It's called Koroshi. The Koroshis are working, or traditionally used to work for the Qashqais as camel drivers. They definitely speak about a dialect of Baluchi, and we have some material from them as well. Here we have a very dramatic story of Goli, who is very mean to her husband, Ahmad, so mean that he decides to throw her in a well, which he does. And then he gets second thoughts and wants to pull up his wife. And he goes to pull up his wife, but out comes a dragon. And this dragon helps Ahmad in all sorts of ways, and finally manages to get Ahmad married off to the princess of this kingdom. So in this story there is mention of towns, of kings, and all sorts of things, and the transformation is this Ahmad, who is so badly off that even his wife is beating him. His wife is maltreating him. And at the end of the story, he is the heir of the throne by having married the princess in that kingdom. And he does it very trickily. You can read the story and see how he does it. And then the final story that I was looking at is about the Indian merchant and the Egyptian goldsmith's daughter. Hindi tajar o misrei zargar. Again, we see that the people in this story are tajar and zargar. They are not agriculturalists, they are merchants and goldsmiths. Thank you. And what happens in the story you can read for yourself, because I have a couple of copies of this article with me. So, and then actually I did a comparison between these oral stories to some written stories, and the written stories I chose to compare them with was Nematullah Gichki's Petit Miras, published in Bandig, Hakim Baloch's Yakar, published in Aseche, Murad Sair's Grand, published in Gichen Azmanak, Hauspahas Urmara 2003, published in Karking, and Khani Parwaz Jaur, published, I didn't find the original place of publication, so I took it from Joseph Elfenbein's anthology. And actually, my conclusions, the conclusions that I think I was able to draw is that if we pose this question, is there an urban mind in Balochi oral literature? Yes, indeed. There is a strong presence to become a king or the king's son-in-law, the foremost merchant of the world, is what constitutes true success. And not, for example, to become the richest farmer or cattle owner. The presence of businessmen is more strongly felt than that of religious men in these stories. In other words, mammon, money, is given more attention than God in this cultural setting. It's thus clear that there is indeed an urban mind strongly present in these stories, but that an urban lifestyle exists only in a fantasy world and is something that one can dream about, but probably never attain. Looking at the modern stories, there is quite much less of an urban mind in the modern stories that mostly reflect the misfortunes of the Baloch, like loneliness and old age is the theme in one of the novels, infidelity, the whims of nature, and other more down-to-earth issues. Now, of course, urbanity in these stories is not modernity, even less postmodernity. But there seems to have at least been an urban ideal very early in Balochi culture, because we assume that these folktales are decently old, and they must at least have been told for 200 years or so, because we find the very same stories in Turkmenistan that we find among the Koroshis who live in Fars, and they parted from each other at a very early stage, at least more than 100 years ago. And the stories were well established, it seems, and they occur in more or less the same variants. So, I shan't take your time much longer, but if you want to listen to these stories and other stories, I have an offer that I can offer you. I have 2 CDs of Balochi recorded stories. If you put your name here on an email, I will send you these CDs free of charge, provided you promise to listen to them and make your children and grandchildren listen to them. So just write your name on a list here and I will send you the CDs. If you want to buy these 2 books, which are linguistic descriptions of Turkmenistan Baluchi and Sistani Baluchi from two of our PhD, there are two of our recently defended PhD theses in Uppsala. At the moment, I would like to give them as a gift to the library again, together with a copy of this paper. So please, Shahid. Yes. If you would like to